2, the signal came in clean. That was the part that kept haunting Commander Yara Solis 3 years later. Not the shape of the thing, not the way it moved, not the thermal bloom that shouldn't have been possible at those speeds. It was the signal. Every sensor on the Castor strike group had picked it up simultaneously, and the data was clean. No interference, no atmospheric scatter, no ghost returns on the second sweep or the third. Whatever had descended from 90,000 feet to sea level in less than a second, the instruments agreed on every single measurement. The numbers matched across platform types. Radar, FLIR, passive sonar, from the submarine running silent 14 nautical miles to the southeast. Everything converged. No sensor artifact, no equipment malfunction, no weather phenomenon that could be cited and filed and quietly allowed to expire. That was the part no one could explain away. That was the part that had cost her a career, nearly her sanity, and eventually, though she hadn't known it at the time, had placed her in this room, on this morning, with this transcript spread across the table in front of her. 14 months since first contact, 7 since the conclave of voices. What the press had taken to calling the listening, that strange suspended period during which the Vreth had parked their 3 city-sized vessels in geosynchronous orbit and simply waited, watching, transmitting data packets at regular intervals that took humanity's best computational linguists the better part of a year to partially decode. The Vreth did not knock. They did not broadcast on radio frequencies. They did not bother with the electromagnetic spectrum at all, except as a gesture of accommodation, as if they had looked at humanity's technology and decided, like a parent crouching to a child's height, to communicate in the medium the child understood. The transmissions were mathematics first, then something that behaved like grammar, then something that the lead linguist on the team, Dr. Pavel Reinhold, had called the most complex embedded meaning structure in recorded history. Every message was nested. Nothing was ever simple. Humanity, to its credit, had answered. Slowly, poorly, with 3 false starts and 1 near-catastrophic miscommunication that had required the Joint Contact Committee to spend 4 sleepless days transmitting what amounted to, "Please disregard the previous message." But it answered. Now Yara was the answer. She was 44 years old, carrying the posture of a naval aviator, even in civilian clothes after 20 years of training it into her spine. Dark hair was cut short, in the way that had become her default after years in the cockpit. The scar along her left jaw was from the landing that ended her flying career. Not from combat, not from anything dramatic or cinematic. Just a wet deck on a night approach and 1 moment of inattention at 130 knots. She had been on the ground for 6 years after that. First as a data analyst at the Naval Air Station Fallon, then as one of the lead investigators on the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force. For her background in threat assessment and her reputation for clean analytical thinking had made her useful in a field that desperately needed both. Then, unexpectedly, against her strong written objections, as one of 9 humans on the Joint Contact Committee, when the Vreth ships arrived and the world needed people who had been looking at the question for years. She was not a diplomat. She had said so in every meeting, every briefing memo, every conversation with the committee leadership that would hold still long enough to hear her. The committee had said, essentially, that they were not looking for a diplomat. They were looking for someone who could sit in a room with the impossible and not try to make it familiar before she understood it. She had said she could do that. She was less certain now. The communique on the table was 4 pages of translated text that represented approximately 40 seconds of Vreth transmission. The density of meaning per second was something the translation team had stopped trying to quantify because the numbers made them feel things they didn't know how to process professionally. She had been reading the same 4 pages for 40 minutes. The phrase that wouldn't let go was on page 3. Reinhold had flagged it in yellow and added a margin note that said, "Multiple valid interpretations. Recommend discussion before response." The phrase itself, rendered as closely as the translation architecture could manage, read, "We have been patient with your silence, but silence is not the same as stillness. You have been moving while not moving. We have been watching that as well." She didn't know exactly what it meant. She had 4 theories, ranging from an observation about human internal emotional state to a direct reference to the weapons programs. She suspected the latter. 3 nations had quietly positioned suborbital kinetic packages in the months since the Vreth ships arrived, under the logic that maintaining deterrence capability in the presence of an unknown force was standard operational prudence. The decision had been made at levels above the Joint Contact Committee, by people who thought about threats the way they had always thought about threats, and saw no reason to revise their framework, simply because the threat was of unknown origin and demonstrated physics they couldn't model. Yara had filed a dissent. She had filed 3 dissents. They were on record, and she had been politely, firmly, told that her role was contact facilitation, not strategic policy. She suspected the Vreth had known about the weapons programs from the first day of construction. She suspected they had known before that. She suspected that the phrase about moving while not moving was not an accusation, but a statement of fact delivered in the Vreth's characteristic way, not as a confrontation, not as a threat, but as an acknowledgement. We see you clearly. We have always seen you clearly. We are telling you this not to frighten you, but because we believe you can hold this information and continue to approach anyway. She thought she was right. She also thought she might be wrong. She was still sitting with that uncertainty when Cho knocked. Commander Solis. Her aide leaned through the door. 27 years old, astrophysics background, perpetual look of barely suppressed alarm that had become so constant she'd stopped noticing it. The liaison team is ready, I know. They said ready 15 minutes ago. I know what they said. She turned to page 4. Tell them I'm reviewing the communique. A pause. The Vreth liaison has been in the interface chamber for 40 minutes. She looked up. Has it indicated distress? The AI monitoring says no indication of distress. Then it can wait. She went back to the page. 5 more minutes. Cho retreated. She heard him in the hallway, murmuring into his earpiece, the soft, anxious cadence of someone trying to diplomatically convey that the person the situation depended on was refusing to be hurried. She turned the page over and read the phrase again, forward and backward. She turned it over again. She read page 1. Then she folded the transcript precisely in thirds, the way she used to fold navigation charts in the cockpit, and put it in her jacket pocket. She had been reading it until she understood it well enough to carry it with her. She understood it well enough now. The interface chamber was enormous, necessarily. The Vreth liaison, whose designation rendered in translation as something between a rank and a personal name, a hybrid concept Reinhold had settled on calling third who speaks in the presence of uncertainty, though he'd warned them repeatedly that uncertainty was doing a lot of heavy lifting for a Vreth concept that had at least 11 distinct emotional registers, occupied roughly the volume of 2 seatsy buses end to end, floating 2 meters above the floor on what the physicists on the contact team called localized inertial suppression, and what Yara privately called the same trick the Tic Tac had been running over the Pacific for 2 decades before anyone would commit it to an official report. The chamber smelled of ozone and something sweet that 3 different analytical teams had attempted to characterize and uniformly failed. The walls were bare metal. 12 human staff stood along the perimeter. Xenobiologists, translation technicians, threat assessment analysts, 2 security liaisons, who Yara had specifically told to stay against the wall and project as little menace as they could manage. Most of them were holding tablets. Most of them were trying not to stare at the thing in the center of the room. Most of them were failing. Reinhold was at his station on the right wall, headphones around his neck, 2 monitors open with the translation algorithms running in parallel. A 3rd screen showing a real-time emotional temperature readout across the color spectrum from blue to deep amber. He gave her a look as she walked in. The look communicated in the compressed language of 2 people who had worked adjacent to each other for 3 years under conditions of permanent, mild crisis. You were late. This was noticed. The thing has been waiting longer than protocol anticipated. Please try not to make it worse. She gave him the smallest possible nod and walked to the interface station at the center of the room. The Vreth liaison was 12 feet away, close enough that she could see, with the naked eye, the way its outer surface moved. That slow, continuous undulation, like the surface of something that lived at depth, like a bioluminescent creature that had never learned that surfaces were supposed to be still. Texture was not anything she had a word for. Not liquid, not the iridescent shimmer of the footage that had circulated after first contact. Something that changed quality, depending on where she was looking, something that seemed aware of her looking. The translation relay was active on the interface panel, its amber light steady, she said. Third, who speaks in the presence of uncertainty. I apologize for the delay. The response came through the relay in the soft synthetic voice that Reinhold's team had calibrated across 18 months of contact attempts. The color indicator beside the relay speaker glowed amber, significant emotive weight. The relay said, "Delay is a concept we considered carefully before this meeting. We were uncertain whether you would come at all." Reinhold caught her eye from across the room and touched the amber light on his display with 2 fingers. The signal, "Pay attention, this matters, I'm here," she said. "You are here," the relay agreed. A beat. "We noted that you read the communique several times before entering. We noted that you retained the document on your person. This is not standard protocol for your delegation." She reached into her jacket pocket. She took out the folded transcript and set it on the interface table between them. "No," she said. "It isn't." The surface of the Vreth liaison shifted, a deep reorganization of its outer layer. A slow and deliberate change in posture that Reinhold team had classified as the equivalent of leaning forward, of focusing attention. His team had also noted that it was a gesture the liaison reserved for moments it considered significant. The relay said, "The others on your delegation speak to us in questions with answers already selected. They come with the form of inquiry and the content of conclusion. You speak in questions with answers genuinely unknown to you." "I'm an investigator," she said. "I spent years in a field where the data was real and the conclusions were forbidden. It leaves a habit." 4 seconds. 5. The ozone smell deepened. The relay said, "Amber warm. We have been observing your species for what you would measure as several of your generations. In that observation, we have not spoken before now. This was a deliberate choice. We were uncertain whether you had developed. The concept is difficult to render. The capacity to hold a sustained act of not knowing, to sit with a genuine unknown and continue to look at it, rather than resolving it to either comfort or threat." She felt something shift in her chest, a change in pressure. She thought about the years before the report, about the pilots who had come back with something that shook them and filed honest paperwork, and found their careers quietly shortened, about the institutional silence that had blanketed the UAP question for decades. Not because the evidence wasn't there, but because the evidence demanded a category that the institutions hadn't allocated space for. She thought about 2021, about the panel broadcast, the cameras, Josh Gates asking her about the radar returns, and her careful, measured answers. She had been careful and measured for years, because the alternative in her profession was to be dismissed. Careful and measured race of being allowed to stay in the room, she said. "We've been working on that." "Yes," the relay said, "we know. We were watching when you began." "When exactly did we begin?" A pause that felt different from the others. The liaison's surface shifted again. Not the forward lean, something else. More internal, the relay said. "The clearest observable moment was when your institutions chose to acknowledge, publicly and formally, that there were things in your airspace they could not explain and would not hide. This was difficult to quantify by our measurements. A small document, a brief transmission, but the willingness to put the acknowledgement into a form that could be read by anyone who asked. This was significant to us." The 2021 report, 9 pages, 144 sightings, 143 unexplained, she said. That document was pretty cautiously worded. "Yes," the relay said, and she would have sworn there was something dry in it. Something that Reinhold would later describe in his notes as the Vreth equivalent of gentle irony. It existed. Before it, the official position was the sightings did not exist. Cautious document that acknowledges the real is more significant than a confident document that asserts the false. She thought about Commander David Fravor, November 14, 2004. 100 miles southwest of San Diego, the USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group running exercises, The USS Princeton's HFY-1 radar, picking up anomalous returns at altitude. Contacts descending from 80,000 feet in less than a second. Hovering, ascending again, doing it repeatedly across multiple days. Fravor and Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich diverted to investigate. Fravor saw below him as he descended. The smooth white shape hovering above a patch of roiling ocean, with no wings and no exhaust, and no visible means of staying aloft. First, the tic-tac, his attempt to cut it off, the way it seemed to register his approach and respond. Not retreat, not attack, just a fluid repositioning that communicated unmistakable awareness. And then the acceleration, gone from his instruments. Reacquired 60 miles away less than 60 seconds later. The radar logs had survived. The FLIR footage survived. The incident reports had survived. What had nearly not survived was Fravor's willingness to talk about it. The way the culture of his institution made honest reporting a professional hazard. The way the pilots came back with these accounts found the seriousness of their experience inversely proportional to how seriously their institution was willing to treat it. Years. The price of reporting honestly was isolation. The price of silence was continued credibility, she said. The people who first reported what they saw, the pilots, the radar operators, most of them paid for it professionally. They lost something for looking honestly, the relay said, amber deepening. We know. And you kept coming. You kept being there to be seen. We kept being present, the relay said. We did not place ourselves in their instruments. We moved in accordance with our own requirements. But yes, we did not hide. She looked at the liaison's slow surface. Were you watching what happened to them? The ones who reported? A pause that felt weighted. Yes. What did you make of it? The relay was quiet for longer than usual. When it resumed, the voice had a quality she hadn't heard before. Not the careful neutral warmth of diplomatic register. Something older and less managed. We observed that the cost of honest witness in your civilization for a long period was very high. And we observed that despite the cost, honest witness continued to occur. This was a pause. This was one of the arguments in our deliberations for continuing to approach. She absorbed that. One of the arguments for continuing to approach. She thought about the Vreth's 417 contacts. She thought about the weight of that number. How many times they had come to a world and watched and waited. How many times they had made the decision to stay or to withdraw. She said, "Can I ask you something that isn't in the briefing agenda?" A pause long enough to feel deliberate. Then amber again. "You may ask things that are not in agendas. Were you afraid of us?" She said it before she could calibrate it. Before the trained, careful, measured part of her could intercept it. When you first started coming, when we were sending jets to intercept, was there anything in you that felt? That was afraid. Reinhold's voice came very quietly through her earpiece. Multiple simultaneous truth layers activating. She gave it time. The Vreth liaison's surface went still in a way she had never seen before. Not the slow undulation, not the posture shifts, a stillness that had weight to it, a concentration. The ozone smell intensified. Reinhold's screens were scrolling fast. The relay said, at amber steep it had shifted toward red. Toward something the calibration didn't have a clean name for. We have a concept that your translation architecture renders very poorly. The closest rendering available to us is the awareness of a thing that does not yet know its own significance. What you sent toward us, in those first decades of observation, was something small and combustion-powered and slow by our measurements, carrying weapons that would require generations of development to threaten us. And the thing inside it was afraid. We could measure this, and the thing inside it was curious. We could measure this also. And the thing inside it did not resolve these two states into one or the other. It held them both at the same time and continued to close the distance. She was very still. In our records of 417 contacted civilizations, the relay continued. We have not encountered this particular pattern, a species that approaches what frightens it, without first achieving certainty about the outcome, without first securing the return route, without negotiating, internally, the fear down to a manageable level before committing to forward motion. We've had a lot of practice being afraid of things and going anyway, she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. We know, the relay said. We have watched your history. We understand the practice had many applications before us. The amber deepened again, something in it that the calibration almost rendered as rueful. Not all of them admirable. No, she said. Not all of them, but the pattern itself, the relay said. The structure of it. Forward motion in the presence of unresolved fear. We have studied it for a long time. We have debated, in our deliberations, whether to call it courage or something more dangerous than courage. What did you decide? We decided, the relay said, that the distinction may not be meaningful. That courage and danger may, in your species, be the same river. She looked down at the folded transcript on the table. She thought about all the people who had pointed themselves at the unknown. The pilots, the analysts, the radar techs who documented what they saw and waited, year after year, for the world to catch up to what the instruments were showing. She thought about the long, badly lit decade between the first honest reports and the first official acknowledgement. She thought about the report, 9 pages, 143 things the most powerful military establishment in human history could not explain. She said the communique, the phrase, moving while not moving, the weapons programs. Yes, the relay said. You've known about them since they were built. Since before they were built, the relay said, blue now, dropping to pure data register. We observed the decision process. She absorbed that. Are you here to tell us to stand them down? We are here, the relay said, to tell you that we know. We are not here to make demands. We have observed, over 417 contacts, that the moment most reliably preceding catastrophic misunderstanding is not the first contact, not the long silence, not even the first conversation. It is the moment the contacted species registers genuine vulnerability, comprehends the scale of what they are meeting, and attempts to resolve the discomfort of that vulnerability through the accumulation of capability rather than the extension of understanding. A pause. You are at that moment. The chamber was very quiet. She could hear the low vibration of the inertial suppression field against her skin. She could hear someone near the wall take a slow, careful breath. You're warning us, she said. We are describing what we have seen, the relay said. The decision is yours. It has always been yours. We are not here to make it for you. We are here because we believe you are capable of making it correctly. And we have learned, across 417 attempts, that capability of that kind benefits from information. She thought about what it would mean to be the civilization on the other side of this, to have arrived at 417 worlds, and sat in the equivalent of this chamber that many times, watching the same pattern play out in hundreds of different bodies and languages and technological stages. The same fear, the same preach for resolution through weapons when the right resolution was through understanding. Shh. The same moment when the balance could tip either way, she said. What happened to the ones who got it wrong? The relay was silent for 11 seconds. She counted. When it resumed, the voice had lost some of its managed register, something older coming through, something that did not quite fit the emotional temperature scale because it was neither warm nor cold. It was the tone, she thought, of something that had seen a great deal and was neither numb to it nor undone by it, just shaped by it. We withdrew, the relay said. The planets continued, the civilizations did not. She let that sit. She did not try to fill the silence. She had learned, from years of interview and investigation, that silence after a statement of weight is not a gap to be filled but a space to be inhabited. You sit in it. You let it mean what it means. After a moment, she said, how do we become one of the ones who gets it right? The relay said, amber returning. Something in it warm and old like a signal that had been traveling a very long time. You are already attempting something that none of the 416 preceding contacts attempted. You have placed in this room someone who carries the questions she cannot answer in her jacket pocket, who reads the same document until it is part of her before she agrees to speak, who asks the things that are not on the agenda. A beat. We have been patient with your silence. Your silence has never been stillness. You have been moving. We have been watching it. We have been hoping for this meeting. She felt the weight of it across her shoulders. Not burden, but substance. Something real and settled, she said quietly. You've been rooting for us. The relay produced a sound that was not the synthetic voice. Something from the liaison itself. from whatever the Vreth used for expression when translation ran out. Reinhold's voice came through her earpiece, very soft. I don't have a category. I think it might be laughter. She looked at the liaison, at its slow, unhurried surface, at the weight of 417 contacts, and however many hundreds of years that represented, all of it sitting in this room, watching her hold a folded piece of paper. She said, I need to recall the delegation. I need to tell them what you told me. Yes, the relay said, and some of them will be afraid. Yes, and when they're afraid, some of them will want to resolve it in the way you described. Yes, the relay said. We expect this. She pressed her fingertips to the edge of the interface table. The surface was cool and slightly textured in a way she hadn't expected. Don't just wait, she said. When that happens, come back, keep talking. Don't let us go silent. She held the liaison's invisible gaze. If that's what it was, the focused presence of a thing that was undeniably attending to her. We do better when we're not alone with our own fear. I know that's strange. It's strange even to us. We're approach animals. We need something to approach. Give us something to move toward, instead of something to arm against. The longest silence of the meeting. Reinhold's screens were scrolling through multiple simultaneous layers. The algorithms working faster than she had seen them work. The ozone smell had changed. Still sharp, but with something else underneath it now. Something she had no word for. Something she would spend years trying to describe to people who hadn't been in the room. The relay said. Finally, the warmth in it not calibrated but real. Something transmitted from whatever the Vreth used for sincerity. This is what we have tried to understand about your species since your first vehicle pointed itself toward us, and we could read what was inside it. Fear and the forward motion together, unresolved. Held simultaneously, like two things that should cancel each other, but instead generate something larger than either alone. We call it the human condition, she said. We've been arguing about whether it's a feature or a bug for about as long as we've been conscious. The relay produced that sound again. Reinhold made a small noise across the room. The relay said, we have not named it. We have only watched it. And we have found, over 417 observations, that it is the most interesting thing we have encountered. That specific combination, fear held with forward motion, the refusal to let one eliminate the other. She pulled out the chair and sat down fully at the interface table. Not at the protocol position closer, directly across from the liaison, close enough to feel the field of the inertial suppression on her forearms, a low vibration that felt nothing like threat and nothing like comfort, and exactly like the feeling she had always carried, going into a situation she didn't understand and was going to enter anyway. Tell me about the ones who found understanding, she said. Tell me what it looked like when they got it right. Amber, deep and warm and steady. The relay said, it looked like this. Outside the chamber, in the monitoring stations, the delegation offices, and the secure conference rooms, rooms where people sat with coffee and uncertainty, and the largest weight their species had ever been asked to carry. Outside all of that, the three Vreth vessels in geosynchronous orbit executed a maneuver that had no precedent in the 14 months of tracking data. They moved, not away, closer. A small adjustment, measured in kilometers against their previous position. Precise, deliberate, unhurried. It registered on every tracking sensor in the network simultaneously. Clean data, no ghost returns. Confirmed on the second sweep and the third. In the primary tracking room, at the facility, the analyst on watch stared at her screen for 3 seconds before speaking. She said, they moved. The senior watch officer crossed to her station. He looked at the data. He said, they're closer. The third person in the room had been monitoring since the ships first arrived. She had learned, over 14 months, not to reach for explanations before she had finished observing. She looked at the data. She looked at the timestamp. She looked at the course projection. She said, they know. They heard something. They're listening. In the interface chamber, Yara Solis leaned forward across the table, toward the thing that had been watching her species since before she was born, and asked it a genuine question with no answer preloaded, and the third who speaks, in the presence of uncertainty, answered her. The sun went down over the Pacific, somewhere below the surface of that ocean, 100 miles southwest of San Diego, in deep and ancient water. A pod of whales moved in their unhurried way through the same sea where, in November of 2004, a smooth white shape had descended from altitude and hovered above a patch of churning water and watched two fragile machines approach it, and had not fled and had not acted and had simply stayed present to see what these creatures would do. It had been patient for a long time. The patience had meant something. The signal had always come in clean. It just took the instruments, and the people reading them, a very long time to say so out loud. In the weeks that followed, the negotiations changed. Not because the world changed overnight. The world was, if anything, more fractured. After the Vreth's warning became known to the larger delegation. 3. Governments increased their orbital positioning. 2. Issued statements calling for coordinated planetary deterrence frameworks. An Emergency Security Council sesh spent 14 hours debating whether the Vreth liaison statement constituted a threat requiring formal response, producing a 12-point memorandum that Yara read in 40 minutes and found to contain almost no new information and considerable new anxiety. She filed 3 more dissents. They went into the record. She was politely and firmly told again that her role was contact facilitation. What she actually did, because her role was contact facilitation, and because she had developed a talent for interpreting that role broadly, was go back to the interface chamber. She went back 11 times in the following 6 weeks, sometimes with the full delegation, sometimes with only Cho and Reinhold. She brought questions that were not on any agenda. She brought the questions that were keeping her awake at 3 in the morning. Not because she believed 3 in the morning thoughts were necessarily wise, but because she had learned, over years of investigation, that the questions you are afraid to ask in daylight are often the most important ones. Shh. The questions your training has taught you to suppress precisely because they go to the center of the thing. She asked about the other civilizations that had found understanding. Vreth told her carefully, in fragments, with the consistent caveat that their records had translation constraints. Civilization had sent a first response that contained only the mathematical notation, "For I do not know," and had then waited. One had suspended all military activity for 11 days, without explanation or announcement. One had brought children to the initial negotiation, not as symbolic gesture but because the children asked questions that the adults, trained in protocol, could no longer ask themselves. She asked what had made the Vreth decide to visit in the first place. This question produced the longest deliberation she had witnessed, nearly 4 minutes of the liaison's deep stillness. Reinhold's algorithms working hard, the ozone cycling through something she had come to think of as the Vreth equivalent of choosing words with care. The answer, when it came: "We found your broadcasts, your projections into the electromagnetic spectrum, the ones that were not intentional communication but simply the exhaust of your culture. We followed the signal to its source, and at the source we found a species that had developed, in what we consider a very short time, the capacity to both destroy itself and to choose not to." Repeatedly, "We found this worth watching," she said. "You came because we kept not destroying ourselves." The relay said, "We came because the not destroying was interesting. Many species reach the threshold. Very few survive it long enough to be worth conversation." She thought about that on the drive back that night. She thought about all the thresholds humanity had stood at over its history. The moments when the mathematics of destruction were fully available, and the choice was made, quietly or publicly or desperately, to set them aside. She thought about the October crisis, 13 days in 1962, when 2 nations aimed everything they had at each other, and the world waited, and in the end, 2 men, under pressure their successors would never fully comprehend, looked at what the calculations were producing, and decided that the calculations were not acceptable. She brought that thought to the next session. She said, "The restraint. When we pull back from the edge, is that what you're hoping we do now, with the orbital systems?" The relay said, "We are hoping you understand why you have always pulled back from the edge. Not the outcome, the cause, the mechanism," she said, "fear, mutually assured destruction. The math stops working. That is the official account. It is not incorrect, but it is not complete." A pause. "In our observation, the moments when your species has retreated from the threshold have rarely been driven purely by calculation. They have been driven by one individual, or a small number, who looked at what the calculation was about to produce and chose to reintroduce the human into the mathematics. She sat with that for a moment. Vasily Arkhipov, she said. The relay said, he is in our records. And she felt something cold move through her. Because the relay had never before in any session produced a human name unprompted. And the fact that it knew that specific name, the Soviet officer in the submarine during the crisis, the man with authority to launch and the restraint not to use it, said something about the depth of the Vreth's observation that she was not fully prepared for. He and others like him, the ones who stood at the threshold and chose to remain on the living side. She said quietly, you keep a record of them. We keep a record of every individual who has altered the trajectory of a species through a single act of restraint, the relay said. It is a long record. Your species has contributed to it substantially. She closed her eyes briefly. She thought about all the people in that record whose names history had not preserved, the decisions made in darkness, in submarines, in control rooms, with no witnesses, that had left no trace except the fact that the world had continued afterward. She opened her eyes. She said, what do you need from us? Right now, in this conversation, to believe we're going to find understanding. The liaison's surface moved in a way that Reinhold would describe in his notes, very carefully, as the most expressive gesture it had produced across all their sessions together. Something more open than attention, more open than deliberation, he wrote. It reminded me of a person setting down something very heavy that they had been carrying for a long time. The relay said, we need to hear that you know the decision is not being made in this room. The weapons programs, she said. The decision is being made by people who are afraid and are trying to resolve that fear through the accumulation of capability. We understand this. But we need to know that someone understands why it will not work. That someone carries that understanding not as a debating position, but as a fact, and intends to be present in the room where the decision is being made. She thought about her dissents, filed, acknowledged, professionally set aside. She said, I'm going to need a bigger room. The relay said, we will wait while you find one. She found one. 4 weeks, 2 reconfigurations of the committee structure, and one very difficult conversation with the leadership that she would later describe as the most honest exchange she had participated in since her first day in uniform. She was not the most senior person in the new arrangement, not the most credentialed or the most powerful, but she was present in the rooms where the decisions were beginning to take shape. And she was present in the way she had always been present, carrying the questions she couldn't answer, and the willingness to hold them long enough to understand what they were asking. The orbital systems were not stood down. She hadn't expected them to be, not immediately, not all at once. But the decision process changed. For the first time, the people making those decisions were receiving regular briefings from someone who had spent months in the interface chamber and could speak from memory about what the Vreth had observed across 417 contacts and what had distinguished the civilizations that found understanding from the civilizations that did not. 7 weeks after the conversation about the bigger room, the third who speaks, in the presence of uncertainty, opened a session with an unprompted statement. We observe a change in the pattern of your decision processes. We note that someone is now present in the rooms where the decisions are being made. We wish to say that we see this. Yara said, what was your assessment before? Probability estimate for us. The relay said, approximately 31% probability of finding understanding. She did the arithmetic without wanting to. 31% of 417. 129 contacts that had ended in withdrawal. 129 worlds where the Vreth had come and watched and eventually turned and left. The 129 civilizations that had reached the threshold and gone over it. She said, what's your assessment now? The relay said, amber warm, lighter than she had heard it before, improving. She went home that night and sat in the dark for a long time. She thought about all the people in the Vreth's record, the ones history had named, and the ones it hadn't. She thought about Fravor in the cockpit, banking towards something he had no language for, holding the fear and the curiosity both and continuing anyway. She thought about Arkhipov below the Atlantic, with the depth charges falling, making the decision that the world would not know it had needed for decades. She thought about the phrase from the communiqué. Silence is not the same as stillness. You have been moving while not moving. She thought about all the years of honest reports that had gone unacknowledged. The pilots who had come back, shaken and written their paperwork honestly and found the cost. The radar operators who had tracked impossible objects and filed what their instruments showed them. The analysts who had built, slowly, painstakingly, in the face of institutional resistance, a record that could not be explained away. And none of them had been still. They had been moving the whole time, through the institutions that resisted them, toward a moment when someone would finally be ready to read what the signal was saying. Outside her window, above the cloud layer off the Pacific, 3 vessels maintained their orbit, closer than their original position, clean on every sensor, confirmed on every sweep, not waiting the way a tide waits. Not the indifferent patience of something that doesn't need to hurry because the outcome is already determined. Something more deliberate than that. More human, in a way, though the word was obviously wrong. The way someone waits, who has traveled a very long distance to reach a particular door, and has knocked and is standing in the dark outside, listening to the footsteps inside, willing them to come the rest of the way. The signal came in clean. On both sides now, there were people who knew how to read it.